Yes, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to the Belgian NCPs, to this exciting event where I have the chance to motivate everyone to apply for the new call for staff exchanges. As we just heard, it opened October 6th, and the closing date is in March, so there's plenty of time to be part of a proposal or to be the lead and draft the proposal. And so I hope with this short presentation, I think I can squeeze it into, I think we have 40 minutes, but I'll try to be quicker so we could move to the questions. And I hope not only to motivate you and give you some case studies, but to show you how it's possible and why you should do it and why it's so easy to do. So let's see if you believe me by the end of the presentation. So next slide, thank you. So you may or may not know that the MSCA actions, so Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, of which Staff Exchanges is part of, are part of what's called the Excellent Science Pillar of Horizon Europe. And there's 6.6 billion euro that's been earmarked for the entire duration of the Horizon program to support these calls. Next slide, yeah. So if you're not so familiar with Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, but I'm sure you are, it's just to remind you they have a new brand name. So these are the names of the 5 actions. So probably the best well-known are the postdoctoral fellowships, which used to be called IF, or individual fellowships, and the doctoral networks. And there's also MSCA and Citizens is where the European Researcher Night is hosted, and a program called Co-Fund. Staff Exchanges used to be called RISE, Research and Innovation Staff Exchanges. But staff exchanges, we feel, is not as well known as postdoctoral fellowships and doctoral networks, but it has many characteristics that are very appealing, especially to those that have the passion to innovate. So for small and medium enterprises, and as well other non-academic sector organizations. This call that we have this year has 77 million earmarked to fund exchanges, and later you can ask me about success rate and everything, but it's very attractive. There's a good chance if you write a good proposal that you will be rewarded for that. So let's have a deeper look into staff exchanges. The next slide, yes. So now in the next slides, I'm going to introduce the main features. So of course there's objectives to the program. And when I think of objectives, it's good to read them carefully because it helps explain the rules. So all the rules that maybe seem complicated are actually quite simple when you boil it down to these key objectives. So the objectives for a staff exchange project or proposal is basically that the main deliverable or activity is the secondments or exchanges. It's all about international, intersectoral, and interdisciplinary mobility of research and innovation staff. So what exactly is the added value? So it's quite obvious that it's the knowledge transfer between participating organizations and between the different researchers participating in the exchanges. It's the collaborations that started during the project that will go on beyond the project duration. And it's the general cooperation across the globe for the particular objectives or scientific tasks of the proposal. Next slide. Here's a lot of bubbles to show you the added value. There's many. So the added value for the staff members, the top bubbles, in terms of career development is huge. The staff members we've asked the question to in surveys that we run or midterm meetings is that they all say that this action has made them more employable, they gain skills and competencies that otherwise might be hard to get. And they have been able to still convert ideas into products and processes and services. They've developed collaborations and networks that they have had and given them an international exposure that they might not have otherwise been able to experience. Now, for the organizations, what would be their added value? So again, there's the transfer of knowledge that takes place. For example, companies working with academia have access to fresh brains or fresh knowledge, and vice versa. Academia can learn a lot from companies. So they have that. They also have collaborative networks that they may have not had before. And we see that in different calls of staff exchanges, these collaborative networks tend to apply over and over again, meaning that the collaborations are long lasting and go beyond the duration of the first projects where they were participating together. And then there's the improvement and increase in their R&I capacity. So maybe it's a good point just to stress that you start and could win one staff exchange project, and we'll talk about the length, but it could be up to 4 years of activity. But you can have a part 2 of the project. So we have many projects that continue and apply again for a second funding, of course, with new targets, new deliverables. So you can apply more than once. Next slide. So now we're moving on to all these eligibility issues of staff, of participants. So it's going to sound like I'm reading the guide for applicants, but it's just to say that there are some constraints and guiding principles. So who can participate in the proposals? Well, you can come from what we categorize as the academic sector or what we call the non-academic sector. The main difference being if they award degrees or not, and whether you are classified or one in the other sector depends on a self-declaration process at the beginning. And our validation services will, of course, check all your documents and adjust if needed. So the next slide is about how many people need to be in, or organizations need to be in your consortium. So there's the benefit of staff exchanges is it's extremely flexible. So the minimum composition of the consortium will be coordinated by one entity, and the minimum composition is 3 legal entities. And these entities must be in 3 different countries. So I'll just take a breath. 3 legal entities, 3 different countries. Now comes another detail. 2 of these entities must be in an EU member state or what we call a Horizon Europe associated country. So hopefully that sinks in. So 3 partners, different countries, can be international, 2 of which have to be in an EU member state or associated country. So not to confuse at this point, but remember the objective in the EU is to have collaboration across sectors. So when you have the minimal composition, at least one of those entities will have to be from the non-academic sector. What's also nice about staff exchanges is we're open to the world. So you can involve what's called third countries. So this is a word to mean that they're not associated with Horizon Europe. So for example, they're not in Europe. They would be the US, Canada, Australia, Brazil, Argentina. These are all third countries. And then we have, so when you work with third countries, then we don't look at the sector. It could be with company or without company. So now there's 2 links in these slides. You will get these slides afterwards because you need to often check what the status is of the countries that you want to work with. So in order to know which countries are recognized as associated countries and which are not, you can simply click on those links. And so I'll give an example. Tunisia, you might not know off the top of your head, but is an associated country to Horizon Europe, so they can be a beneficiary. Whereas a country like the UK or Switzerland are no longer associated countries or member states. So both of these countries, Switzerland and the UK, are considered third countries. Okay, I'm sure there'll be some questions about that, and we can take some cases in the question section. So next slide is about, well, what I think is the most important question is who can be seconded? Who is considered an eligible staff member? So staff is a rather vague term, I understand that. So let me just say that all types of staff involved in research and innovation activities can be seconded. So that includes researchers, naturally, but not only researchers. It can include administrative staff, managerial staff, and importantly, technical staff, with the caveat that they must be involved in the actual research and innovation aspects of the project. So I've got some examples of that if you have questions. So all of these staff members, so it's the whole career range from postdocs, PhDs, professors, all of these staff members can be seconded for a minimum of 1 month. And this 1 month doesn't have to happen all at once. It can be split into days or weeks for the duration of the whole project. But it has to add up at the end of the project to 1 month to trigger a payment to that staff member and organization. So the maximum time that a staff member can be seconded is 12 months. And they don't have to do it at the same institution. They can hop around to different institutions in the project. The only caveat there is you need a minimum of 1 month at each of the different organizations. So there would be a maximum of 12 organizations you could work with, or 6 if you do 2 months at each organization. And as I said, you can be at any career stage. So I think this makes staff exchanges a highly attractive Marie Skłodowska-Curie action. The other actions are limited to either doctoral fellows or postdocs. So it's for the whole career. So it allows me to say one important point here. We always get a question about master's students. So it's important to know that the researchers that are seconded, they need to have or be a candidate or have a doctoral degree. So if you'd like to second a master's student, this is possible if they fulfill all the other conditions, but we prefer, and well, it's a requirement now, that you second them under a technical staff. So yes, master students, if they have the right profile and background, they can be seconded as technicians and not as category researcher. All staff members have to be devoted full-time to the project during that secondment, and they need to have some kind of contract, or at least a letter that the sending organization has that shows that they have, let's just say, control or a management ability of that staff member. And it has to be that the staff member has been engaged for at least 1 month before he or she is sent for their first secondment. That was a lot of conditions and rules, but it's quite straightforward. Maybe I can give an example of an administrative staff before we change slides. So what would an administrative staff do on a secondment? Well, it won't be eligible if the administrative staff goes on secondment just to do a managerial task or a project management, writing a report or setting up a meeting. The administrative staff that I've funded in my projects are staff that are needed, for example, to set up a database. And it could be in epidemiology that they have to go to another country, and they're supporting that country and organization to set up a database for collecting surveillance data for a specific disease. So you see, it's an administrative staff. They don't have a research background per se, but they have a skill that they bring to the project to achieve a task necessary for the research. So I hope that was a good example for you. Next slide is about what I call the tic-tac-toe board of eligible exchanges. So it's an extremely complicated slide, it seems. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. I realize that the font is quite small, but what you should notice on the right is the sending organization, and on the top is the hosting. And the little boxes and the font, it goes top to bottom: academic organizations, non-academic, associated partners that are eligible for funding, and associated partners not eligible for funding. And at the top, under hosting, you have those same categories. So you can mix and match at each level to see if it's possible or not. So a green check mark means yes, that is an eligible exchange, meaning eligible for funding by the staff exchange program. Whereas the orange X's mean that that secondment will not be eligible for funding under the staff exchange program. Now, you might be wondering what the 1/3 means. I'll come to that. That's a new feature of staff exchanges. So let's take some examples so you can know how to use this tic-tac-toe board. Oh wait, we'll just stay here for a minute. So let's go to the bottom right corner. There's an orange X. So that is an associated partner not eligible funding going to another associated partner not eligible for funding. Well, that's an X because for two reasons. One is that the action doesn't support third countries seconding to other third countries. So that was an obvious one. Let's take a less obvious one. How about sending from an academic to a associated partner eligible for funding? So the third box at the top. It's a green tick mark. And it's green because that's actually what's nice with this action is anybody who's a beneficiary or academic and underneath non-academic, the two green check marks, we send and fund under the action people going from Europe or associated countries outside to the world. So that direction is always a green tick mark. But have a look at the bottom that there's the two orange X's for sending from a third country, not eligible for funding. Look what happens when you send it to an academic organization in a member state or associated country. So, and we're going now from third country, let's say the US. No, sorry, not the US. Let's say Argentina, which I think is a country eligible for funding. And an Argentinian can come and be at an Italian university. That's a green check mark. However, look just underneath at the orange X. What if it's a country like the USA and they would like to send someone to that Italian university? Well, that's an orange X because the USA is considered a high income country and is categorized as not eligible for funding under the staff exchanges. So it means we won't use the funds of the project for that. But let's say it this way, the US organization could pay themselves to send that person to the Italian organization. You can still put that secondment in the plan, and in fact, we ask you to. It's just for that partner in the US to know that they have to have their own funds. And that's part of giving a letter of commitment and showing that they, whatever they write down, if they're going to do secondments, that they really will do them, and they've signed a letter of commitment to justify that. Before we leave this game board of possibilities, I want to explain the 1/3. This is an exciting new feature of the staff exchange programs, because look at the top corner. It says you can send from an academic organization in a member state country 1, say Germany, and you can send them to a hosting organization in another country, let's say France. In the past action, that wasn't possible because it's academic to academic. But our experience from the first program and listening to our scientific community, there was enough arguments to influence the policymakers to make a new rule that you can do that secondment and it will be eligible for funding. The only caveat to that is that exchange must be not only between countries, but between disciplines. And the 1/3 symbolizes that you can have those exchanges, but a maximum of 1/3 of your total secondments. And I'll explain, if you have questions, how you do that in your application, but there will be a table that you fill in of secondments, and you will have to put keywords that allow the evaluators to judge if it truly is interdisciplinary or not. And there's information about advice we give you of which level keywords to use that are in the guide for applicants. And also you have the text of your proposal to explain why those are necessary for the project. So the 1/3 is academic to academic in 2 different countries, or it's non-academic to non-academic, so same sector. As I said earlier, with 3rd countries, we don't pay attention to the sector. So you're free to send academic 3rd country to academic European, or same sector, non-academic, or a mix. So there's no restrictions other than it has to be 3rd country to a beneficiary who's part of the program. Okay, deep breath. I hope that sunk in, and it's quite fun actually to mix and match and make sure that you can do the project you want within the constraints we give you, which are linked to the objectives of the action. Let's move on. So let me look at time. We're at 10:35, so we still have 20 minutes before questions, but I don't think I need that long. I'll just move on to the heart of how we enable this with the funding. So what exactly does Staff Exchanges fund? So first of all, the funding is based on unique costs per unit we call person month. So that might be a strange word for you, a person month. And the total budget for 1 unit of a person month is 4,600 euros. And that money we give you as a unit cost. So staff exchanges are very easy to make a budget for, because it's just how many person months, how many secondments. But we've broken down that budget into 3 categories that you must pay attention to when running your project and planning. So we have 2,300 for the staff member, and also funds for the institution. So let me, before I tell you what we fund, I'll start with what we don't fund, or what's not eligible for funding. So this action doesn't fund salaries. we fund what we call a top-up allowance. So the staff member unit costs with 2,300 are meant to be a top-up of the salary that the secondees receive. So for example, a technician or a manager or research that's being seconded, in addition to whatever agreement they have with their hosting organization, they will get that money per month for use for the secondment. So it should cover the travel expenses, you know, planes, trains, buses, car rentals. It should, that 2,300 has to be documented for that. And it has to be documented for the sustenance costs or subsistence costs and any other costs related to mobility. This is not a flexible type of cost, meaning the only thing that's audited in this project is exactly that 2,300. And in the guide for applicants, it's very clear what kind of documentation you need. It's not heavy, but it just has to answer to those questions of proving that that money went directly into the bank account of the staff member, or as organization, you can prove that you paid for the tickets, the accommodation, and that the rest of the money was given to the staff member to be able to go on secondment. Well, now we'll move on to the institutional costs. Oh, wait, we'll just go back. These are divided again to two further categories, which is research, training, and networking, and management and indirect costs. Here, there is some flexibility, and the flexibility can be determined in a consortium agreement and also a partner agreement with those that are third country or associated partners. And this we require you to sign and prepare once you're preparing your grant. So for example, I'll give an example why that's useful, because I mean, we call it your internal cuisine. When you as coordinator get the money, you could give it out to everyone by the number of secondments they promise to do. It's your internal cuisine, we say. But we often suggest that you as coordinator think carefully of your project needs and how you distribute the money, the pre-financing and the costs may be based on performance. Also, it could be you have secondments that are very expensive, so sending staff from Europe to Japan. In that case, that 2,300 euros, again, agreed in the consortium, you could use some of that money if the plane tickets are extremely expensive or the accommodations or some equipment you need. So again, you agree between you how to pool those resources to do these things. Also, this pooling of money between partners of the 2,300 flexible money you could use to run a workshop. So it's your internal cuisine, but you can look to other projects and how they do it. When we invite you to our coordinators day, you can get tips and tricks from other project managers or coordinators to see how they best administer their funds. Okay, I hope that was clear. So now we'll move on to a summary of the key features, and then I'll move on to the bits you need to know about how to submit an application. So in terms of key messages, so far I would like to remind you that the next call opened recently in October. There's 77 million euros earmarked for that from the call. And I think last year, the final numbers aren't out yet, but I think at the time we'd published that we had had enough money to fund 72 projects last year, and they fall into the different panels. And I'll explain when there's a question about which panel should I apply for. So the budget is allocated per panel, depending on how many proposals are submitted. So for example, engineering is always a popular submission panel. So they get the largest chunk of the budget normally, whereas math and physics in the past years has had only 15%, for example, of the submissions. So they only get the 15% of the budget. So back to key message, that was just an add-on of that there's a good chance to win a project, and you should pick your panel carefully. So about the money, the unit cost is 4,600 euros total, which are split into the two categories I mentioned. For the staff allowance, that's what we call category A, and the institutional allowance or category B. For the secondments, I talked already about the minimum duration in an organization has to reach 1 month by the end of the project. So you can split it up in small pieces. And the maximum for one researcher is 12 months, and they can do it in multiple organizations as long as they have 1 month minimum in each. We talked about same sector secondments. And this is when they're based in countries that are part of the EU member states or associated country, that this is interesting. And I mentioned that there's a table you will fill in and prove that those same sector secondments are interdisciplinary. And it will be a ceiling of 1/3 of the total person months of the whole project. The length of the project is a maximum of 4 years. And a maximum of 360 person months per proposal. So it's just to know, normally our projects that we receive are 4 years long, but it's not a requirement. If you just have a project you can finish realistically, including delays, in 2 years, then it's possible that project could be funded, or 3 years, but I would have to say the norm of the projects we get are 4 years long, because it gives more time for the networking and to build these important collaborations in the consortium. So before we move on, I'd like to say a few words about the previous call, because it was the first call we had in Horizon Europe. And I'd like to tell you, for that call, the success rate was 30%. So if we would add as well projects from the reserve list that made it for funding, it was even higher, it was 40%. And that's just a number that's a little bit of an incentive to explain that actually in staff exchanges, the success rate is higher than in doctoral networks and postdoctoral fellowships, where it's down around 13%. So keeping that number in mind, that you have a good chance, if you have a good idea and you have a passion to innovate, and you show why your consortium is the right one for the job, then there's a good chance, if you follow the instructions I'll give you in the next few minutes, and you read all the documents carefully, that you will be winning a grant from the next call. So we'll just move on now. So that was all about the action and some details that maybe gives you some questions. Now we're going to talk about what I call the nuts and bolts of submitting. So first is to watch out the deadline. So although it's in March, we have Christmas in between. So it's good to start getting your ideas already together now and not leaving it to the last minute. And you can find partners, you can start, calling up, having workshops online, just to put together a nice proposal package. So that's the dates to monitor. The next slide is a little bit busy slide. So it's just to show you where you submit. So do you want to change? I hope you're familiar with this one-stop shop for all the funding in the EU. So this is what's called the Funding and Tenders portal. And before you start using it, you need to get an EU login. Then you need to register your organization, and you will get what's called a PIC, PIC number, and I've forgotten what that stands for. Maybe it's a personal identity code, but it's a unique number. And just because you get that number, it doesn't mean the registration of your organization is finished, but it does give you a way to fill in the administrative forms should you be invited to participate in a proposal. You'll have to be validated, as I said. So also be aware that we don't want you to create multiple PICs for the same organization. So you can also know from your administration if you have a PIC already, or it's probably searchable online. So in the Funding and Tenders portal, you have several tabs in this homepage, and the tab you go to is Search Funding and Tenders tab, and then you'll find there the call for staff exchanges. You also have a tab on how to participate, and here you can actually have a feature called Partner Search, where you can see other entities that would like to find a partner to participate in your proposal. And then you have a Project Results tab, a Work as an Expert tab, and a Support tab. These could be interesting for you. In the Results tab, you can get some inspiration for your project. And of course, not for this call, but we would love you to register as an expert so you could be called to be an evaluator on other calls. So that's an introduction to this portal. Let's go a little bit deeper then. What happens when you get in there? So the next slide shows when you click on the right tab that you get the call open, and you should click on Open a Submission. You choose the programming period as shown in the slide, and then you have the call indicated already. And it's enough if you click on the 2022, and there'll be a number of documents there that you will access and read, and I'll show you in the next slides. So the next slide, oh wait, did we miss one before that? Or there. This is, yes, the online manual. So, and the work program. So the work program hasn't changed between 21 and 22, but this really makes you understand what we're looking for if you have a peek at the work program. So it's worth time checking that. The next slide, I think, shows all the other documents. Yes, so it doesn't take long. It looks like a lot of documents, but top of the list is the guide for applicants. It really is the recipe of how to apply and how to convince the evaluators, not that you've just cut and pasted and made a standard proposal, but you've really thought about what you're proposing and give arguments and justifications that the evaluators can assess to decide if your plan is credible. So read the guide really carefully before you start writing the application. The work program is something I would also look through again to understand the objectives, sort of the high level policy goals. Then the next document you'll read is the template for how to make a proposal. You have to follow exactly the font size, the length limit, and also there's information about how to do tables and figures. And so please find the right template. You also can glance at what a grant agreement would look like, so you can convince your partners that it will be a good contract for them. And then, of course, you can have a step-by-step online manual to guide you through each step. And very useful is a list of frequently asked questions that are available. Hopefully I answer most of them today, but if we missed to talk about one, they should be in this database. The next slide, and we're almost done. So this is just to say, once you read all that information, you're going to find that there's two parts of your application. There's what we call the part A, which is all the structured administrative data that you fill in online in a very simple way. So there's no paper, it's all online. Then we have the part B1 and B2, which is actually your free space to describe your action and to convince us it's a great project. And this, again, you have the guide for applicants and you have the downloaded template side by side as you go through and fill it in. Next slide is, it's in the guide for applicants and work program, but this is something to be studied. It's the basis of the evaluation. And I know we have Anna with us today, who was an evaluator, well, a vice chair last year, sort of the overview of all the work of the experts. And she's also been an expert many times. And we instruct our evaluators and the vice chairs that support us to understand each of the words in these criteria. So please ask if something's not clear, but essentially 50% of your score will be based on how well you answer to these 3 sub-criteria of excellence. Then 30% of your score will be to do with impact. So not just impact in your field, but you're going to have to answer to questions that might be new to you about societal impact or technological impact. So don't skip that part, just give the justification and your ideas of how you can best impact your field and the research you're doing with citizens. And the last criteria is called quality and efficiency of the implementation. That's 20% of your score, but don't be misled by that 20%. The experts are told to really be tedious with this part to make sure that they believe that you can manage this project. So they're looking if you can implement what you say, if your plan is feasible, if it's well thought out, and if you've thought about risks and all that. So it's like a job interview. You know, you have to answer the questions to convince the panel of experts in this exercise that your proposal is worthy of a high score in each category. You need a minimum of 70% score to be considered for funding. But of course, it's only the projects that are on the top that are the ones that will get selected and put on a ranking list. And then it will be the commission staff that goes through the ranking list with the budget we have available for each panel and invite people to prepare a grant with us and to work with us. So now I think I'll end with some tips and tricks. I think I've been dropping some hints throughout the whole talk, and then we'll be ready for questions. So, so how can you guarantee success? These are some tips and tricks, and you have your national contact points. So don't hesitate, of course, they're there for you and we'll explain how they can help you. And of course, they don't break confidentiality rules and guide you to the right source of information very easily. So the NCPs are really an important part of this whole process. So as I said, the first tip was about closely following the call requirements. Always have the objectives of the action in your mind and show how you're going to reach those expected outcomes. You know, it's not like some grants where you're just trying to impress us with amazing science and you use up 30 pages or 29 pages for that, and then you only have 1 or 2 pages for the rest. So balance your proposal to meet all the criteria in terms of the 30-page limit. Then we've given you excellent guidelines, the guide for applicants. I think at the NCP website, there's also lots of tips. Then we ask that you highlight always the EU dimension. So for example, if your project is about the ocean or about soil or about cancer, it's great that you're aware that the Commission has these as main missions, and that in the impact section, you could show how your research will actually feed into important policies at the EU level. So this is well rewarded if you can do that with your proposal. Then, yeah, don't start late. It's always good to give time to get a second opinion from a colleague to proofread it, and also your NCP might offer some feedback or services. Then about the collaboration, why do you work in a consortia? So we expect in your proposal that you describe the benefits of why you've brought these organizations together, and convince us that it's not going to be a one-off collaboration, that actually it will lead to sustained collaboration. Yes, and of course, the tip of all tips is to contact your national contact point. So how do we end here? We have, the next slide is just to say, be inspired. You can go into this database, the link is there, called Cordis, and you can look up projects that were funded in the past to get a flavor. I'm going to give you a few case studies right at the end, but you can go into Cordis, type in keywords in your field, and see what other projects have been funded in the past. Another slide is the next slide. Again, this is to tell you maybe Staff Exchanges isn't for you. Maybe you're more interested in training PhDs and the doctoral networks. But whatever the case is, please have a look in this portal to see what's available to you. And as I said, we really love to hire new experts every year. And the best way to write a good proposal is to work as an expert, because you see firsthand the other side. So Anna can confirm that. So the next slide is just to tell you we will have an info session coming up. I think, well, there's one that's been recorded, and I believe there'll be one in December run by my agency. And well, the last slide is just to thank you. And my colleague Francesca, who had to run out for the fire alarm, that was actually her part of the talk. So I'm just going to spend 2 minutes to stimulate some questions. So the next slide should be, so this is my part now. I was going to give you a few project examples just to get your imagination going. So the first project is actually one that was in my portfolio. It was called Papa Build. So you see the acronym can be quite fun. It was funded in 2015. It was a project in physics. So this was submitted in the physics panel, but it was an interesting project because it was about, it was a university who specialized in acoustics, and they worked with other beneficiaries in these countries, Slovenia, Austria, Croatia. They had 6 beneficiaries. It was a Belgian coordinator in Leuven, and they had 2 non-academic partners. So they had companies, universities, and their goal was to use the physics, how we measure sound and acoustics, and work with companies that make materials, and materials to insulate buildings. And together, the materials company and the physicists with high-tech equipment could work on improving sound insulation. And this was of high impact because there's policies in the EU about noise. So they completed this project successfully, and they made great innovation with less than €1 million, and a wonderful consortium that continued on to get funding to bring this product, I believe, to market. So that's one example from physics. It's not all about the stars and black holes. It can also be a very practical project. Next slide is a project in the chemistry panel from my colleague Sotiris. And this is about nanocomposite materials and an oxidation process that allows for water treatment and decontamination from pharmaceutical chemicals. So as you can imagine, the EU policy that's important here is linked to the mission on ocean and clean waters. So that's a selling feature of this project. But also they have companies involved, they have global partners, and they have beneficiaries in Europe. So it's quite a strong coordination or consortium with a Spanish coordinator this time. And again, under €1 million worth of person months. Look how happy that consortium is. They love to meet, to exchange, and they really get to know each other by sending and hosting people in their organizations. And the last slide for inspiration is a project that was called Waste Card. And you can see this device here. So they actually, it was in the life science panel. And the project, the main outcome was a prototype for a wrist and arm sensing technology for detecting cardiac arrhythmias. So for the citizens, you can imagine this is an obvious success story of something that can benefit them. And look at the cost for this project. It wasn't even €500,000. They had at that time a UK coordinator. So this is just to remind that now the UK cannot be coordinator because they're considered a third country. And third countries can't lead work packages and they can't coordinate the project. But it could have been the French, the Irish, Croatian could have been taking that role. There was non-academic partners involved, of course, who designed or made the prototype. And again, it was a global collaboration. So that's it from me.